The plasma membrane. Without one, cells would not be, well, cells. They would probably be just a blob of liquid wandering around, a complete mess. So thanks to plasma membrane, cells are able to keep things organized, have a structure. And this relatively thin structure that does so much for the cell might look simple at a first glance. But it is not. The plasma membrane has an intricate, clever mosaic structure which allows it to give the structure that the cell needs and much more. Now, glad you joined me in this video where we will explore the structure and function of plasma membranes. Okay, you might think that this is the perfect time to take a nap because why the heck should you learn about plasma membranes? I promise you that this video will be more interesting and exciting than the majority of Netflix original movies. So at least that. Let's first take a moment to find out why the cell membrane is so important for the cell. The most important thing about cell membranes is that they can separate a cell from its surroundings. So in a way, the structure of cellular membranes allows them to compartmentalize the cell and at the same time to selectively import and export certain substances. You can basically think of it as a factory, where there is an incoming goods area where raw materials come in, and an outgoing goods area where the final product is ready and is dispatched. Now, membranes are usually composed of three important components. They are proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. Now, how important is this protein, lipid, carbohydrate trio for the cell? Well, we're going to find out. The two most important components of membranes are phospholipids, or lipids, which form the basic matrix of the membrane, and proteins which can be either attached to the membrane surface or they can be embedded in the membrane. The third component is carbohydrates, which can be attached to both the membrane proteins and lipids. The organization of these components is very important and plays a pivotal role in the function of the cell membrane, but more on that later. For now, we will look at the organization of the membrane in more detail. Cell membranes basically are a mosaic of proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. And what do I mean by mosaic? No, I'm not referring to the famous and fabulous mosaics of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, or Pompeii. Not at all. However, the membrane structure is characterized as a fluid mosaic, which is a model proposed by Jonathan Singer and Garth Nicholson back in 1972 after carefully examining electron microscopy studies which had been carried out in previous decades. In their model, Singer and Nicholson compared proteins to icebergs floating in a two-dimensional lipid sea in a random or mosaic distribution. An important fact about this model is that integral proteins can diffuse laterally in the lipid matrix unless their movements are restricted by association with other cellular components. Now get this, the lipids of the cell membrane are a specific type of lipids called phospholipids. They form a framework known as the phospholipid bilayer, which consists of two layers of phospholipids. Now, what is so special about phospholipids? Well, they have an amphipathic nature, which means that they have a water-fearing part, also known as a hydrophobic part, and a water-loving or hydrophilic part. We need to have a look at this image on the screen in order to understand how this bilayer is formed. So as you can see, the tail of the phospholipid is the hydrophobic region and forms the interior part of the membrane. In other words, the part of the membrane that is not in contact with water, while the hydrophilic head of the phospholipid is on the surface of the membrane, which is in contact with water. The proteins which are contained in the cell's membrane can perform a variety of functions. For example, membrane proteins can break down glycogen by acting as enzymes. Other important functions of membrane proteins include involvement in cell signaling, ATP synthesis, photosynthesis, and cell-to-cell adhesion, just to name a few. There are two main categories of membrane proteins known as integral proteins and peripheral proteins. proteins. All of these different protein categories have both different functions and structures, and they also have different ways of attaching to the cell membrane. Peripheral membrane proteins or extrinsic proteins do not interact with the hydrophobic center of the phospholipid bilayer. Instead, they are usually indirectly bound to the membrane through interactions with integral membrane proteins, or directly by interactions with lipid polar head groups. Proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane are known as integral proteins. And as the name implies, integral proteins are proteins that actually make integral part of the membrane, and they cannot be removed from the membrane unless we disrupt the cell membrane's integrity with the addition of organic solvents or detergents. Another component of cell membranes, as we mentioned, are carbohydrates. Most membranes contain carbohydrates attached to lipids and proteins. However, the ratio of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins can significantly vary among different types of cell membranes. For example, we find a large amount of carbohydrates present in eukaryotic cells, whereas the inner mitochondrial membrane possesses a low amount of carbohydrates. Approximately 50% of the membrane's mass is protein, and the remaining is mostly lipids. But lipids, due to their much smaller size, outnumber proteins. Now that we talked about what cell membranes are made of, it makes sense for us to shift our focus to the properties of cell membranes. As I mentioned before, cell membranes separate the cell from its surroundings. That makes us think that the cell membrane acts as a barrier between the cell and its surroundings because it is very solid or rigid. Surprise, surprise, that is not true. In fact, cell membranes have properties of fluidity, meaning that individual molecules remain in close association, but they are still able to readily move within the membrane. In a way, cell membranes are fluid, but the best way to describe them is to say that they are semi-fluid. Molecules of a fluid substance can move in 3 dimensions. But remember that the cell membrane is composed of phospholipids, proteins, and carbohydrates, big molecules with lots of complex interactions between them. For example, the rotation of phospholipids is 2-dimensional. They are basically able to just switch positions, as you can see on the screen. For that reason, we can say that the lipids in the cell membrane can affect membrane fluidity. Membrane fluidity can be affected by the length of the phospholipids. The length of their tails can vary between 14 to 24 carbon atoms. It is known that the shorter the tail, the less likely to interact with each other, hence the more fluid the membrane will be. So in a way, these short and antisocial lipids increase the fluidity of the membrane. Additionally, the presence of double bonds in the fatty acid tails makes the lipid molecules unsaturated. The kinks in their tails push adjacent phospholipid molecules away, which helps them maintain fluidity in the membrane. Therefore, the less interaction there is between molecules, the more fluid the membrane is. Finally, the membrane fluidity can be affected by the presence of cholesterol. Cholesterol tends to stabilize membranes, but its effects are heavily dependent on the temperature. In higher temperatures, cholesterol makes the membrane less fluid, while in lower temperatures, it makes the membrane more fluid. Now, after learning about the structure of cell membranes, let's have a quick look at how the membrane actually works. The key function of cell membranes is to transport or movement of molecules and ions in and out of the cell. They manage to do so thanks to the ability of the membrane to be a selectively permeable barrier between a cell and its external environment. You can think of it as border control checks where the membrane decides what needs to enter and exit the cell. For example, molecules such as amino acids and glucose are in high demand for cells, and for that reason, the membrane allows them to enter the cell. In contrast, waste products that cells need to get rid of can exit the cell through the membrane. This movement of molecules between the cell and its surroundings does not magically happen. There are two main different ways of membrane transport. They are passive transport, which includes diffusion and facilitated diffusion, and active transport. Now we're going to find out what are the differences between these types of transport. In passive transport, a substance moves from a high concentration region towards a low concentration region. The important thing to highlight about passive transport is that no energy is needed in order for passive transport to be carried out. Now, the difference between diffusion and facilitated diffusion is that in diffusion, a molecule can cross the membrane without the need of a transport protein, whereas in facilitated diffusion, a transport protein is needed in order to transport the molecule across the membrane. Now, what about active transport? Well, in active transport, the main differences are that a substance moves from a low concentration region towards a high concentration region, the opposite of what we saw in passive transport. And active transport requires the input of energy, for example, through ATP hydrolysis. It should also be mentioned that active transport needs the aid of a transport protein in order to move molecules across the membrane. And we cannot talk about membrane transport without briefly mentioning osmosis. Thanks to the process of osmosis, water can move in and out of the cell. Water can diffuse through a membrane from a solution that is hypotonic or lower solute concentration into a solution that is hypertonic, higher solute concentration. And that is the general concept of osmosis. We will cover membrane transport in more detail on a different video, but for now we have finished our video about the fluid mosaic model of the cell membrane. I hope you have enjoyed it and that you have learned a lot about this amazing structure. Remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. I will see you soon.